Hi, and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's review for 13 Reasons Why Season 2. In this video, I'm going to get into full-on spoilers of Season 2 of 13 Reasons Why and get into some more detail on what I thought about the season. Now, I have also done a spoiler-free review of 13 Reasons Why Season 2, so if you haven't seen Season 2 yet, you can watch my quick review of 13 Reasons Why Season 2 that is completely spoiler-free. This video will contain full-on spoilers for it, so it is only for those who have seen the entirety of Season 2 of 13 Reasons Why. Now, in my spoiler-free video for 13 Reasons Why Season 2, I talked a bit about how this season was a disappointment for me. Because Season 1 felt like it was a self-contained story. It worked really well, and I still very much love Season 1. But I was worried when I heard there was going to be a Season 2 that it wasn't going to really be necessary, or was it going to feel tacked on because Season 1 worked so well as a self-contained story. And it turned out, yes, it did very much feel tacked on, and I didn't think it worked anywhere near as well. A lot of the plot structure wasn't worked out very well. It undid a lot of the great character beats of the first season. And there were, things about it I didn't like. So this video, I'm going to get into a lot more detail than I did in the other video on the specifics of what I thought worked about this season and what I thought didn't work. So let me structure this video in the way, let me start with what worked about the season. Because there were things I did like about the season. As I mentioned in the other video, I binge watched the entire thing within a couple of days. So it did keep me interested enough to keep watching and to see where they were going toward, and I didn't think the season totally sucked. There were some things about it that did work that I enjoyed. So let me start with those. So let's start with the fact that Season 2 gave different perspectives. And this, I think, is actually a really cool idea, because in Season 1, each episode was structured on a different tape about a different character. So each episode was focused on a character, but it was narrated by Hannah as you listen to her tape and what she said about the person, how they affected her death or her wanting to kill herself. And for this season, we get the courtroom structure, which I'll get into in my negatives a bit more. But it allowed for each episode, again, to be about a different character. But in this time, we get their perspective. And I think that was a cool idea. Now, as I said in my spoiler-free review, I don't think they took full advantage of this idea. It didn't work out as well as it could have. But I still liked it, and I think in some cases it actually really did work, where especially when their story doesn't match up with Hannah's story, because in Season 1 Tony talked about how that's Hannah's truth and you have your truth, and this season we actually get the other people's truths and not just Hannah's. So I thought that was a cool idea, and sometimes it did really work. Now, one person in particular I really liked seeing their truth was Mr. Porter. Now, in my spoiler-free video, I talked a bit about how there was one episode I really liked this season. That was the one that focused on Mr. Porter, where he was giving his testimony in court. And I have to say, seeing his perspective, he eventually breaks down, starts crying, says he didn't do enough. That really worked. I actually gotta say, this did bring tears to my eyes. I thought it was a very effective emotional scene. Now, as I mentioned though in my spoiler-free review, that this being the high point of the show wasn't as high as the high points in Season 1. And part of that is that they were just redoing basically exactly what they did with Clay in Season 1, where Clay, you can see his regret, and he displayed, broke down and displayed how he wished he could have done more to save her. And then you see the scene where he actually goes inside his head and we see what he should have done, where he tells Hannah, he's like, you know, I'm not going to leave, I'm going to listen to you. And then eventually the scene, Hannah's like, but you didn't do this, and I'm dead. And I really loved that. That was one of my favorite scenes of all time. That was one of the best things about Season 1. Now, Season 2, they did the exact same thing with Mr. Porter, and it was also effective. It was great. It was different, though, than the first time, because you see Mr. Porter's perspective, which, you know, rather than Clay, who was someone who was like a lover, someone who cared about her in a romantic sense, Mr. Porter was more of the teacher, the mentor who cared about her in a sort of a adult looking out for children way. And so it gives that different perspective, and I think it really worked as well. And it shows the kind of regret that he had. But when you boil it down, it's basically just rehashing what they already did in Season 1. And just doing it from a different perspective. And so, as good as it is, and I am putting this in the positives, because as I said, it brought a tear to my eyes. I thought it was really effective. It was great seeing his perspective. But as good as it is, it will always just be a lesser version than what they already did. But I still did really enjoy it. And also just the whole way Mr. Porter's storyline played out. I liked the way that his wife was very supportive. I liked that he was like, just broke down in court and said, yes, it's the school's fault, even though he knew it was going to get him fired. His conscience like drove him to admit that he was wrong. And it was great because before this episode, we got a lot of interactions with Mr. Porter and the other students who had listened to the tapes, and of course they always dropped these jabs at him every time he tried to help them. And it's like, well, what about you? You know, what do you do? It's your fault. Why didn't you do more to save Hannah? And I think this really got to him. And I love that way that they played out, that the interaction shows that the adults in this situation aren't above the children and what the teenagers, and that what the teenagers say can have effect on them personally. And I think that whole thing worked out very well. And another thing I liked about the season was Alex's storyline. Now, Alex, some people really liked him for Season 1, but for me, I wasn't really always that into his character story. It was okay, I guess. He just felt a bit underdeveloped to me, and then his attempted suicide at the end of the season I thought was just kind of a just jab for attention, and it's something that didn't quite work for me, but it worked really well for me in this season. I love how they started it with him being the one, because of his attempted suicide, that he didn't remember anything from what happened before. And that was a side effect of him, you know, the trauma he caused himself by trying to kill himself. And I love that and I love that it didn't, like, they started to show like 5 months after these events, so they didn't bog it down and take too much time getting into the suicide. They just jump you right into the story where it's been 5 months and he's a totally different person, and he's exploring like the reasons why he tried to kill himself. So it's kind of like getting into the reasons why, and there's a good juxtaposition between him and Hannah. So they both tried to kill themselves, but one was successful and the other wasn't. And I love getting that juxtaposition of it. And the danger, like his parents were really concerned about the dangers of him investigating why he killed himself. And the friends, of course, were concerned because he knew about the tapes, but he couldn't remember what was on the tape, so he kept bugging Clay, and eventually he did. But Clay kind of did it for his own selfish purposes, which is interesting, and some of the other friends thought it was a bad idea. But yeah, so he was someone who's actually very interesting this season to follow, and I actually bought him a lot more in this season than I did in the previous season. So overall, I thought his storyline did work a lot better than it did in the previous seasons. Now, another character beat I liked was Sky and her relationship with Clay. I gotta be honest, I did like an hour-long review of Season 1, if you saw that, and I never in that whole entire hour mentioned Sky, because she never really seemed that important in Season 1. She kind of felt like kind of tacked in and thrown in there, like she'd show up every once in a while and say mean shit to Clay, and at the end you find out it's because, you know, she's pissed at him for ignoring him all these years, and the season kind of ends with Clay going off with her. So this season starts with they're in a full-blown relationship. Some things about it worked, some things didn't work. But what I thought really worked was the whole fact that she had the breakdown where was hospitalized, but she again made it very clear that she's not trying to kill herself, but she does have some mental issues where she cuts herself, and she says more so she can feel something. And I have known a lot of people in real life who did feel this way, so it did connect to me in that way. And something that, again, probably touched on my personal experiences, but something I thought was illustrated very well in this show. And how she basically, Clay blamed himself, of course. And I think the way the show set up made it feel, the audience feel that it was Clay's fault too, because they had a huge argument. And then immediately following that argument, she gets hospitalized. So how wouldn't you think it's Clay's fault? But I love the aspect that it's not Clay's fault, and she even has to say, this has nothing to do with you, this is my own mental issues. You need to deal with your mental issues first before you can relate with me. And she basically moves to another town to escape over issues, and Clay sort of has to learn to deal with that. Because at first he's like calling her on the phone all the time, he's really worried that he did something wrong, but he has to accept the fact that she has her own issues, and that he's, it's natural for human beings to always be selfish and always think, this is my fault, she's hurting herself because of me. But he has to accept the fact that it has nothing to do with them, and he just has to accept what she needs to do to heal. And what she needs to do to heal, unfortunately, is to not being in his life anymore. But that really doesn't, it's the ultimate, it's not you, it's me, but it actually holds up. It's not just an excuse to not see anyone you don't like. It actually is true in this case. And that portrayal was really good. That was a really realistic portrayal. I thought really worked. I also like Justin and Clay's relationship. It was a very cool contrast from season 1, where they were pretty much bitter enemies. But Clay at first sees Justin as he's like a tool. He's the linchpin that he can use to get back at Bryce, to get justice for Hannah or whatever. But in doing so, they sort of bond. And I thought that was very natural. That felt very natural. The flow, the structure of it really worked. I totally bought that by the end of the season, Clay's parents wanted to adopt him, and he was thinking of him as a brother. And of course, like, season 1 was also great about getting into Justin and not showing him as a villain. Is showing that he has troubled parents who, mother's a drug addict, and stepfather, or the person that his mother's seeing, is like a drug dealer who abuses him. And so it makes you see that other side. And I think season 2 explores that even more and carries on this great story that shows just how destructive this is to Justin. And one of the perspectives I love seeing probably would be Justin's, like in contrast to Hannah's perspective, because you get more, like Hannah's side, she just sees it as Justin used him and abused him, but you see from Justin's side that he had this caring relationship with Bryce, because he was this poor, like, beat up child, and Bryce was the only one who looked after him. So Bryce had earned his respect and earned his admiration, but of course Bryce had his own reasons, and he ends up being abusive and sending out the pictures of Hannah, which will ultimately lead to her bad reputation, which pretty much destroyed her life. But I love how it explores that. It explores that there's always more to each story than one side, and I thought that worked really well here. Now, there's also retconning. There's 2 characters I thought they kind of retconned, because in my season 1 full-length review, there are 2 characters I complained about that I didn't buy, that I thought didn't work. And I think season 2 is almost like they were listening to me, but of course they weren't. I think it's obvious that I wasn't the only one who had issues with these characters. I think these issues were very obvious. So in season 2, they took these characters and completely redid them and addressed what made them unbelievable. So it was kind of, I call it retconning characters. Now, there's 2 of them, but I'll talk about one in this category, the positives, because I thought they did a good job of retconning her. But the other one I'll actually mention in the negatives, because I thought they did a bad job of retconning that character. But the character I thought they did a good job of retconning was Courtney. because I complained about her. And although I will say it was kind of a little too late, because I complained about Courtney in season 1 that her motivations, and I didn't buy why she was so staunch on not being found out that she's gay. That it would have, even though it's cliche, it would have made more sense if her parents were like Baptists or priests or hardcore religious fanatics who were against homosexuality. But the fact that her parents were two, gay men, I mean, I could understand why because she saw all the problems that they had, and she wouldn't want to go through the same thing. It could explain away some trepidation she might be feeling, but the fact that she was so staunch and like, out for blood and fuck Hannah, blah, 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 because she so desperately didn't want to get found out, I did not buy that. So in season 2, of course, she does come out, and she comes off as a lot more relatable, and you see that kind of relationship she has with her fathers, and why she might have had the trepidation before. Now, it doesn't excuse her behavior in season 1. I still don't buy that. But in season 2, they correct that behavior. They don't continue it. They make her more believable than she was in season 1. Like I said, it doesn't excuse what they did in season 1, but it says, we recognize this mistake, so we are going to make her more believable in this season, which I thought really worked. Also, showing the more dynamic of these villain-type characters to the point where you can almost agree with them. There's a couple characters I already mentioned. Justin, Bryce was another one, showing Bryce actually does have these, positive attributes. Like he had learned from his mistakes, because we see him with his new girlfriend Chloe, and when they're about to engage in intimate relations, he asks her several times, is this okay, is this okay? But he does it in kind of a forceful way, so it shows that he's not completely there, that he still has some issues. He kind of does it in a way where she doesn't really have the option to say no, but still, again, it shows him as a more dynamic character, because it shows that he looked out for what he did for Justin. Like, he didn't have to look out for this poor kid who was getting picked on. He could have just been a bully and picked on him like everyone else, but he actually stuck up for him. And that carried out throughout, like, even through their teenage years. That you could see that Bryce, whenever Justin was getting abused, Bryce would take him in, let him stay with him at his house, and really look after him. So it did show that dynamic to everything, and it did show Bryce's side of things. And I love how they did Bryce's episode, where you see his lies on the stand, where he's saying, Hannah just had a thing for him, and they had this off and on relationship, which of course total bullshit. And later in the episode, you get the truth from his perspective, where you actually get the spin on how he spent things, and it made it very clear that he had a thing for her and he was rejected, and that's part of the reason why he did what he did. Now, it doesn't at all, not in the least, try to excuse his behavior, but it does explain it more and make it more dynamic. That being said, it makes it very clear what he did was wrong, and that he should be punished for what he did regardless, but it gives you more of an insight of why he did what he did and what sort of went wrong with him. So he comes off as a dynamic, realistic villain, and not a mustache twirling cliche, which I always like. But he's still a villain, don't get me wrong. You still want him to see him punished, and what he did was totally in the wrong, so he's still the bad guy, but he's a believable bad guy, and I love that. Also, on that topic, he doesn't really get punished, does he? And I love that. I actually think that's might not be the type of get up and cheer ending you want, but it's realistic, because I've actually read about a lot of these cases in high schools where a popular jock or someone who has a popularity is accused of sexual assault. They almost always get off with a slap on the wrist, and that is so realistic. And of course, that's what happens to Bryce. And it does damage him a bit. He had this promising career as an athlete that was destroyed because of it. but he doesn't really get any jail time. He spends like 3 months in juvie and then gets probation. So he basically just gets this slap in the wrist, and as frustrating that is, that's typically what happens in cases like this in real life. So I think it was very important to portray that in a realistic way, and to not just give the audience this awesome happy ending, and be more realistic in the type of disappointment that people will actually suffer, and how this affect Jessica and the other people who were victims of his abuse, and how seeing him just get off the hook like this just because he's popular, and of course the contrast of how they treat this rich popular athlete compared to how they treat someone like Justin, who actually was just an accomplice and came forward and eventually did the right thing, and he ends up suffering a worse sentence just because of the way the legal system is structured, because he didn't have a parent to claim him to look after him. Now, I think even in this show was a bit too generous, because it shows that Clay's parents eventually look after him, but in real life, like a lot of people who are as impoverished as he is, wouldn't have anyone at all to look after him, and would basically be screwed and get a much harsher sentence than someone who is way more guilty than he was, who gets off with a slap in the wrist. And as frustrating as that is, again, very realistic portrayal, which I really liked. And again, this season does a good thing to focus on a more realistic portrayal of how victims of sexual assault deal with this and how it affects their lives. And I think they did a great job with Jessica's storyline, and she meets up with another person who suffered through this kind of abuse, and how it shows her like she has her own way of dealing with it. At first she's very helpful to Jessica, but then you realize part of how she deals with it is to push it aside, which is not necessarily the healthy thing to do, but also portrays how difficult it is to actually address these things and make them public. And you totally agree with and see Jessica, and you can see what she ends up doing at the end of the season isn't as helpful. And so it is a realistic portrayal of how victims of these crimes are set aside and not given the due that they should be, and often mistreated. So that was great. Another thing I really liked about the season, well, I mean, it's not great that it happens, but it was great the way the show shed light on this issue. I should make that very clear. But anyway, another thing I liked about the season is that towards the end, at the last episode, Hannah's mother goes to Clay and says she found this note saying the 11 reasons why not, and that apparently Hannah wrote to try to talk herself out of killing herself. So there's 13 reasons why, there were 11 reasons why not, and she gave the note to Clay because he was apparently on it twice, which I liked. That was a really nice touch, although it is kind of retconning because it was never really implied before, and it seems like it's very obvious, something they just thought up in this season. But I still think it worked. I think it was a nice touch, something I should have touched on a bit more, maybe. But anyway, that's what I have for what I thought worked in this season. So now, let me get into what didn't work this season, which, again, I have more reasons. Just kind of like Hannah, she had more reasons to kill herself than not. I have more reasons why this show didn't work, or this season didn't work more than it did. So let's start with the story structure, which was all over the fucking place. It really just did not work at all. So basically, like, the advertisements and everything was focused on these Polaroid photos, and the first episode you see these Polaroid photos come out, and like the little intro incorporates the photos instead of the tapes. So I thought the photos would play a very important part, and even the episode titles focus on these photos, but they actually aren't really that important. They play the side storyline about what they call the clubhouse, and to me, they kind of half-assed that whole storyline. And this, again, the whole idea of having a clubhouse where sexual abuse takes place is realistic, something that happens in real life, but I think they really shortchanged it. And then we find out that these photos were basically just taken by Zach. And of course, Clay asked the obvious, well, not taken, but they were shown, they were given, and had those notes written that Hannah wasn't alone. And they find out it was Zach who was doing it. And so the obvious question Clay asked is, well, why didn't you just come right out and tell me? And he said, well, because I'm a coward. I'm sorry, bullshit. I'm calling bullshit on that. What he should have said was, well, because then we wouldn't have this cool mystery in the plot. And the show, the plot requires there to be a mystery. So if I just went out and told you, then we couldn't have this mysterious photos pop up. And so we had to do a plot. That's the real reason. The whole thing, I'm a coward, that's just a bullshit excuse. Don't buy it at all. And yeah, and just the whole thing, and the photos end up getting stolen. I guess, it shows the Jessica's friend, how, again, as I was saying before in the positives, how she was dealing with her trauma and in kind of the wrong way, and it builds off that when she steals the photos. But still, I think that's pretty dumb for the plot. And then we find out, like, all these mysterious notes, death threats and stuff, we find out are completely unrelated to the other two, and it's coming from that other jock guy who I can't even remember. And I think they kind of half-assed his storyline too. But anyway, let me get into another reason why the season was not good. And, this is the other side. I talked about the retconning of characters, and I talked about the Courtney and how that worked, and I said there was one other character that didn't work, and that's Tony. I explained in my Season 1 review that Tony, I did not buy him at all. He came off as an unrealistic Yoda type, and they even, they were meta about it and pointed this out, but it didn't make it better. That calling him unhelpful Yoda, that he was just all wise and had all these wise things. And it's obvious they could see that wasn't realistic, and they went to retcon it. But they went too far, and it was too inconsistent with how he was portrayed in Season 1, that he came off as almost a completely different character in this season. So I did not buy this was the same character. I think they went too far with retconning, where he was pretty much no longer wise at all. He no longer had any of these wise things of advice. Now he had anger management problems. I'm sorry, but if Tony had these anger management problems, there were many times in Season 1 where he would have just kicked Clay's ass when Clay was being a total dick to him, and other people were being total dicks to him. So this character that we see in Season 2 is just nothing like his first character, and it was too jarring. And I understand them wanting to retcon and correct these mistakes in Tony's character, because as I explained, it didn't work in Season 1. But they went about it in a very clunky way that it just didn't buy at all and just didn't work. And on those same lines, let me get into another character who I thought the storyline didn't work. It was a nice try, but it fails, and that's Tyler. And because it's obvious, like at the end of Season 1, they're setting Tyler up to be this like school shooter. And I wish that, and as I said in my Season 1 review, I wish they would have just dropped that, because I think that was a bad idea. And throughout Season 2, they took such a long time to get there, and it was so obvious when he was shooting guns in the woods and he had this obsession with guns that that's what they were building towards. Now, I did like, as I mentioned Tyler in the positives, because I did like that they showed him as more dynamic, and I like that they showed, because in Season 1 he was portrayed mostly as a creepy stalker type, and I love how Season 2 actually showed the other side. There's more to it. He suffered through a lot of abuse. He's a human feeling character with purpose, so that side of it I did like, but I think they went about it in a very sloppy way. Like, I liked the fact that he found new friends, and I thought his friend that they found was cool, and they went out and did all this vandalism and shit, their way to fight the system. So his story was actually working for me throughout most of the season until towards the end. Of course, I lost sympathy for him where he didn't just admit that he accidentally jizzed himself in the movie theater and whatnot. I guess it's kind of realistic that he would be too ashamed because he was picked on his whole life. But the way he yelled at the girl who was just trying to be helpful for him, I think those guys were right to toss him out. And I would have liked his storyline better, quite frankly, if they didn't turn him into an asshole at that stage. But I just think it went off the rails where he went back to being this like gunman, disturbed shooter. And now they had the part where he was abused, sexually abused. We had the mop shoved up him. And they talked about this a bit in the after show and how this is actually a huge problem with males being sexually abused, so they wanted to show the other side of that. And I did like that. I think that's a good idea, but I think the way they went about it was all wrong. Now, last thing I want to do is sound like one of those MRA types, because I'm not in the slightest, and usually they piss me off, to be quite frank. But I did find it a bit weird, a bit noteworthy, that typically in fiction, whenever there's a female who's sexually abused, they take that issue seriously, and show how real life victims of this kind of abuse deal with this trauma and how it affects their lives. But when fiction shows males who suffer the same kind of abuse, they automatically turn them into psychotic gunmen who go out and want to kill people. I've seen this so many times. And so I think they actually did disservice to this issue by making this be Tyler's motivation to want to go out on a shooting spree. I think it would have been a lot better served, the issue would have better served that they treated his character the same way they treated like a Jessica or Hannah, and showed the trauma of sexual abuse can have on males just as well as females, but by turning him into this like psychotic gun, because in real life a lot of these gunmen aren't like abused like that. They just have inherent mental issues and other sort of issues that aren't sort of related to that kind of thing. Typically, not always, but I'm speaking in general terms, obviously. So I think they should have dropped the whole thing about him wanting to kill people. And plus the way they did it is like they were building up to it, but then they never went there, and then all of a sudden just pops up out of nowhere. And I find it unrealistic that his plan to deal with these jocks who he knew were beginning to bully him would just be apologize and I'm sorry. He should have known that would not fly, and should have been more prepared for an attack like the one he got. And I think the whole thing was extremely poorly handled, and I'll get more into this ending a bit later on. But anyway, let me get into my biggest complaint of the season. Now, I mentioned this a bit in my spoiler-free review, how there was one episode that I really liked, and I already talked about that was the Mr. Porter episode, but there was one episode I absolutely hated. I could not stand. It's the worst thing ever. I put it up there with like the episode 6 of season 1 of Mr. Robot, which I rail against, as it actively pisses me off, and I hated it. And this actually, honestly, I was going to give season 2 a 6 at first, but this episode alone brings it down to a 5. In fact, it should bring it down even more. I'm not going to give individual ratings for individual episodes, but for this episode, I'd give a 1, the lowest rating. This is one of the worst episodes I've ever seen, and let me finally get to the point. It's the episode with Zach, and in my notes I just have Zach written all in capital letters with exclamation points. Fuck this episode. Now, this episode undoes everything. First of all, alright. Zach, in this episode, he puts out the revelation that, God, I'm getting so angry just thinking about it, that he was having a sexual relationship, not necessarily a romantic, although there were romantic undertones to it, but more of a sexual relationship with Hannah Baker the summer before she died while Clay was away. Alright. I like the idea. I kind of get where the writers are coming from. I like the idea of having Zach, showing him, because he's portrayed as a good guy, and they explore that more in this season, which it was just all well and good. I like that, and I like it shows that a bit more, but they shouldn't have done it with Hannah. They should have had a different character that he had a relationship with, but then I guess they had a hard time of tying that into the courtroom, because what would that have to do with the courtroom? Why would he talk about it? So it had to be Hannah. So many issues I have with this. First of all, this is an obvious rewrite, an obvious retcon. Obvious they just thought of this in season 2, and it's very extremely painfully hit me over the head obvious that it does not at all, in any way, shape, or form, jive with what we've seen in season 1. Not at all. The writers tried to do this to write in built-in excuses. Oh, this is why we didn't hear about it before, but it's all the biggest load of bullshit I've ever seen. So the obvious, very obvious, like, inconsistencies is why didn't Hannah mention this on her tapes? And the bullshit excuse that they give in the episode is, well, this was personal to Hannah. She didn't want everyone listening to it. Bullshit. Everything she said in those tapes was personal to her. That's the whole fucking point of the tapes. That's why she did it. Like, she told people about being raped. She told people about seeing Jessica be raped. How is her having a sexual relationship with Zach more personal than that? It's fucking not. And there's other things that are, like, maybe not as poignant. You could say, well, that's because it was traumatic and it was so poignant to the story that she had to say it. But there's other things like the stuff with Tyler and stuff with Courtney, which wasn't as, you know, kind of, you could say it's just kind of throwaway, just like the Zach relationship thing. But she mentioned that. She obviously had no compunction of saying anything that's personal. And plus, like, the very fucking obvious thing is in her tape to Zach, she acts like there was no further interaction between them after that thing with the note. And her having a sexual relationship with Zach, and Zach eventually just, you know, not wanting to tell anyone about it and saying, well, just letting it go, that would be more hurtful for her. That would be more of a reason why she wanted to kill herself than him just throwing away her notes. And yeah, again, don't fucking tell me, oh, it's because it's personal. That is such a bullshit excuse. Does not at all go along with what they're saying. And it's just so frustrating. Now, on top of the fact that it does not at all fit, not in the slightest bit does it fit what we've seen before, because it was a huge deal. That would have been in the fucking tapes. But other than that, it completely and totally undermines Clay's storyline, her whole relationship with Clay. The whole point of this thing, and they try to bring it up later in the season with like the 11 reasons why or whatever, is that Clay was her only out. She was her only friend, the only one who cared about her. But then we show this as, you know, Zach somewhat cared. They had a sexual relationship through the years. That undermines her connection with Clay, and that really damages the whole story. In fact, when I'm looking at season 1, I'm gonna have to just pretend this whole thing doesn't exist, because it doesn't really. It's bullshit they came up with a year later to try to keep things going. So it just doesn't exist in my mind. Otherwise, it damages her whole relationship with Clay, because they even say at the end of the season, Justin or I can't remember who the fuck it was, but somebody says to Zach, oh, you and Hannah would have been a cute couple. Bullshit! Fucking, that's bullshit! That completely undermines. This isn't just like a shipping thing. Oh, I ship Clay and Hannah, I don't ship Zach. It has nothing to do with that. It has to do with character development, it has to do with plot development, it has to do with what makes story structure work, and having this whole Zach thing completely destroys Clay's, oh, fuck! It pisses me off so much. I want to give this season a 4 now because of this, but whatever. I'll stick with my rating of a 5 that I gave in the spoiler free. But fuck this episode. Fuck it. Well, to be fair, I was actually thinking about giving this season a 7, because as I had a lot of positives. You might have been listening to all those positives, like, why are you so sour in this season? Because you have so much good things to say about it. This is why. This fucking exact thing is why. It's dropped not from a 6, but from a fucking 7 down to a 5, and maybe even a 4. But anyway, fuck this episode. Let me move on. Alright, so I kind of touched on how this confuses Clay's storyline, but not just the Zach thing. This whole season, it was kind of, I don't know. His storyline was very clear in season 1, and as I said, like, if you see my review on season 1, the tape, his episode where they showed his tape was, I think, one of the best episodes of television ever. Like, I put it up there. I had it, like, in my awards. I gave it an award for best written script. It was so good. And Clay's storyline this season was so lackluster compared to that. Even not compared to that. It was such a piece. It was so bad. It was just like, you know, him and Quartz talking about the time they got high or whatever, and they tried to be all artsy by having an animated feature at the start, and it doesn't work at all. And It was so contrived. I'll get more into this courtroom stuff later, but that episode in particular was so contrived, plot-wise. It was obvious, we need something to hurt them in court, so let's have Clay say something that damages them, and he'd be all upset because he damaged his case. And what that actually showed for his and Hannah's relationship didn't help construct it at all. But even though I liked the stuff with him and Sky, I do think it was kind of like, it was a good idea at first that Sky would notice that he was still hung up over Hannah. But then he was kind of hung up over Sky, and then he's kind of hung up over Hannah at the same time. I don't know. That kind of leads into this whole thing about the imaginary Hannah, which is, this is such a plot contrivance I've seen other shows do before. Now, sometimes it can work where they have an imaginary character talking to them. Usually someone who's passed away, like I'm thinking of the Expanse novels, really work there. But here, it just comes off as a cliche, as a stereotype, something that just does not work at all. It's just really cheesy in the way that, I guess sometimes it worked, like when she was just reciting verbatim the tape 12 or whatever, now is feeding Clay's need to go out and kill Bryce. But for the most part, it was just really cheesy. And plus the whole thing with Clay wanting to go out and kill Bryce, that was such a, if Bryce actually saw that, he would have done something about it. He wouldn't have just not done anything, but then that would have hurt the plot of the show. And it was just so contrived. Like, Clay wouldn't go that far to take a gun out and try to kill Bryce. I mean, they just really fucked his character story up this season. I'm sorry, but they totally did. And on that matter, let me move on to, I think Sherry was criminally underused this season. I was really hoping to see a lot more of her. Now, I talked about a bit of her in season 1, how she was one of the more interesting characters to me. And I love how they kind of didn't bring her in until late in the season. I was hoping they'd do the same thing here with her here, because we actually didn't see much of her in the first couple episodes. We see her a bit more in her, how she comes in to, help Justin through his withdrawal and stuff. And of course, Clay's initial reaction is to be really pissed at her, even though apparently she's been away and she served her time for lying about the stop sign. And of course, Clay very naturally is going to still be upset for helping get his best friend killed. I mean, obviously that's something you don't forgive easily. But I think they kind of dropped the storyline that I thought up in season 1. Maybe people will tell me it's because I'm wrong, but I wish they would have explored this more, where she actually loved Clay because Hannah's tapes portrayed him in such a positive light that she was able to see him for the good person that she is, and that's why she was so concerned about what she thought of him. Now, even though it is realistic that he wouldn't be able to forgive her very easily for what she did, but I think it would have been great storytelling if he did eventually, if she kept working on him, and if she was the one who got in a relationship with him towards the end of the season after Sky went away. I don't know, maybe they're planning this for season 3, but as I said, I'm probably not even going to watch season 3, so I don't care. I think that would have worked here. Or maybe even not even have Sky and focus more on Sherry. Just use her a lot more. But maybe that's just me. But that's what I think. Anyway, okay, so let me get into this courtroom stuff. This is very contrived. This is not at all realistic. All their testimonies was obviously plot devices so they could each have their own episode and have this narrative story, but the way they talk is not how people in real life talk in court. They talk like someone who's writing a poem or writing a novel would talk, like, oh, my regrets, blah, blah, blah. That's not how people talk in real life. It felt very fake to me, and the whole structure, what the hell does this have to do with the case? It doesn't. It's there to drive the plot, and it was so obvious. And anyway, Hannah's parents. Talk about Hannah's parents. In season 1, in the flashbacks, right before Hannah killed herself, shortly before Hannah killed herself, she talked in the tapes about how her parents were so in love with each other, how they were so perfect for each other, and now we get another obvious retcon that does not at all fit in the slightest bit with what we see in season 1, that Hannah's father was cheating on her mother, and Hannah knew about it. Bullshit! bullshit. It took this couple, it was such a stronger story too, that this was a strong couple with a perfect relationship, but then their daughter killed themselves and it completely destroys them. How they deal with this trauma. Like, to clarify, like at the start of season 2 where they're separated, that I totally buy. That they coped with the loss of their daughter in different ways and they couldn't get through it, and the mother was more hung up and more out for revenge than the father, and that was sort of having a divide in the relationship. That worked. That was realistic. I loved it. They fucking ruined it by having that bullshit retcon with the saying that he was cheating on her. I think it was perfect the way it was. They could have just said that he found another woman who actually was there to listen to her because Hannah's mother, I'm sorry, I can't remember her name, but she just couldn't deal with the suicide and was driving her to not be a good person to be around. They should have stuck with that. It's a great story. It's realistic. I don't mind the fact that they drove the parents apart, that they separated the divorce. I think that really works. I buy it. What I don't buy is that Hannah knew that they were fucking cheating on her. That's total horseshit. Hannah talked about how her parents were great, how they were so in love with each other, how she looked at them with role models. Having this scene where Hannah knew and she sent her mother flowers because she knew that she just found out their husband was cheating with them, completely does not at all fit in with season 1. Fuck those scenes. Anyway, and I think they really misuse Chloe's storyline as well. This character seemed really unnecessary. I guess they had to have a girlfriend for Bryce to sort of show the dynamic of he's a rapist, but he has a girlfriend. What's this like? And sometimes it started to work, and especially when they found the photo that she had been raped by him. But it made no. I guess they try to explain how girls can be intimidated into doing the wrong thing, I suppose, which is realistic. But it doesn't really, because they're fearful of the repercussions or whatever, but it doesn't really, I don't know, I thought her jumble line was really, story-wise, it was really storyline was really jumbled, and it just didn't make any sense, and it didn't even need to be there. It seemed like the whole thing with the photos were, the fact that she just ran out of the courtroom and didn't say, why even have the photos in the first place? It seems like that whole storyline just was pointless. Speaking of things that are pointless, there are a couple of characters who are pointless, didn't need to be there. Fucking Ryan. I talked about Courtney, how I did like how they reconnect their character, but what did she contribute to the season? Nothing. And the whole thing about Marcus, I suppose they had the storyline of him getting blackmailed. They're just trying to keep these characters relevant. And they're not. They're just not. They're just pointless. They don't need to be there. I think, actually, I complained about them in season 1, saying these characters didn't need to be there either. And in season 2, they even more stand out as unnecessary. Why the fuck are they there? And at the end of the... Oh, God, I'll get into this cheeseball ending. But at the end of when they're all hugging Clay when he's hearing that song, I kind of liked that at first where he heard that song that was him and Hannah's song and he was crying and his friends looked out to him, but they went overboard with it. But what really pissed me off is Sherry wasn't there. Sherry wasn't there, but instead they had Ryan and Courtney. What the fuck did Ryan and Courtney care? They wouldn't care about this. This is so dumb. Alright, so now let me get into this cheeseball ending. This ending was so stupid. First of all, by the time we got to the final episode, halfway through, actually almost pretty much the entire episode, I was lost complete interest in the show, and I was almost going to turn the episode off, but I kind of kept watching it just out of obligation, because the show had already worn thin with me, and I was completely uninterested in the direction they went with it. I already talked about this shit with Tyler, how that was kind of really mishandled, but the whole thing at the dance, of course the ending where Clay was like, oh, Tyler, oh, please, blah, blah. That was totally that was 100% unrealistic. They even mentioned in the after show that in real life something like that happens. You do not do what Clay does, and there's a reason for that. But of course, Tyler's whole motivation was unrealistic too, so let's have this unrealistic thing. It was just so cheeseball. I'm sorry, but it wasn't the whole thing. And then they had fucking Justin, still shooting up between his toes. Now that is realistic. It is something that addicts would do, but story-wise, they're doing it just so they can create more plot threads to keep season for there to be a season 3, and the whole thing with Tyler, of course, is so they can end in a cliffhanger where, oh, now the focus is going to be on him, which is horseshit. It's total. This is in the whole love triangle they're building up between Jessica, Alex, and Justin. Fuck that. Who cares? That's so boring. I do not give one solitary shit about that. So that is why, if there's going to be a season 3, I am not going to watch it, because I have completely, totally, and utterly lost all interest in this show. That ending was so bad, I really don't care what happens next. Anyway, a few more things before I go. Let me talk about these multi-purpose jocks. Now, I don't know how it is nowadays, but I'm pretty sure it's still the same, because when I was going to high school, they didn't have the same exact jocks at a high school playing every single sport. they specialized in a sport. It's like every freaking jock at this high school is Bo fucking Jackson, or who plays multiple sports. I mean, fuck. Last year it was basketball, but this year it's baseball. And then towards the end of the season, they show that they're playing football too. What the? Alright, that's too much. They're football, basketball, and baseball players. What? And that's a nitpick, but come on. And then, speaking of baseball, like the whole day focused like the clubhouse or whatever was the baseball team, and the baseball team was the one accusing him of being a rapist. What about Jeff Atkins? He was on the baseball team. Was he involved in this whole clubhouse thing? In fact, when they were looking through the clubhouse photos and Clay saw one that pissed him off, I was expecting it to be of Jeff, but no, it's of Hannah, which, who cares? So that's really inconsistent, and so they should have, because season 1 made it clear that Jeff was a baseball player, and Bryce and frickin' Zach and all them were basketball players. Keep that. Maybe have them be football players too, okay, sure, but it totally fucks up the dynamic by, so was Jeff involved in all this bullshit? Anyway, enough of that. I'm done ranting about this show. I already gave my rating in my spoiler-free video, but in case you didn't give it, it's a 5 out of 10, a 5 average. Yeah. I already talked about this, like it could have been a 7, but that fucking Zach thing, there's just a lot of things driving this show down. Maybe I'm being too generous at giving it a 5, I should give it a 4, but as I said at the start of the video, I did go on for a long time about a lot of the positives, so okay, deserves at least a 5, but I'm not even going to watch the next season. Anyway, that is it for my spoiler review of 13 Reasons Why Season 2. Be sure to check out my channel, as I cover many other shows, many other videos covering lots of shows like Star Trek, The Expanse, Game of Thrones, Babylon 5, and more. So be sure to subscribe so you keep up with all of that. And thanks a lot for watching.